solutions, such as average cost pricing, as well as why those types of second-best solutions can arise not just because of explicit government regulation, but through a natural market interaction. We'll then talk about some problems arising from average cost pricing, and then focus on the insurance market, talking about the distortions created by selection, and then applying that empirically to think about the insurance market, as well as some other policy issues that arise in this market. Okay, so today we're going to focus on natural monopoly, but Maria, could you tell us some reasons other than natural monopoly, why monopolies arise in practice?
Because technology enables them to succeed more than others, and then they start expanding.
Yeah, so they could just like beat other companies to the market and sort of be there ahead of time before somebody else is able to get in. So that's one important reason. Another is intellectual property, which is what we're going to either, they just have trade secrets, or the government offers them explicit protection. And when that's the focus, when that's the cause of monopoly, we'll talk during the next lecture about whether that's a good or a bad thing. Another way can just be lobbying the government to give you protection from competition. For people who are just coming in, by the way, there's evaluations. You'll have time probably at the end of the class to do them, so it's not a big problem. So that can be very harmful, both because it causes all the harms we associate with monopoly, but also because it encourages people to lobby the government to protect them. And you'll have a problem set, the last problem set will probably have a problem related to that. Another reason can be that if something is in an illegal industry, then once you're already breaking the law to supply the illegal commodity, you might as well break the law also to kill off your competitors in supplying that illegal quantity. And that's why during Prohibition in the United States, during drug control, there have been so much violence associated with these markets. And that should be dealt with, obviously, through law enforcement rather than other types of policies. And then there's just the issue that Maria pointed out, which is, you can get a temporary advantage. And usually that can be resolved by making markets more transparent, by lowering the bureaucratic barriers to entry into an industry that can help resolve those types of problems. But things can be much trickier when a monopoly is natural or inevitable. Contagious is contagious? Yeah. Okay, contagious. What does it mean for monopoly to be natural or inevitable?
Well, through here reading today that article. So
Yeah.
So when it's like economies of scale and the firm it's better to have one firm than to have many firms because it's more cost effective.
Exactly. So one way that would certainly do it is if there's just like plain old economies of scale, right? Then clearly it's going to be more efficient to have just one firm. And this is probably the most common case, but it's not necessary. So there could be a case where there's just, I think I'm actually going to draw some graphs of this in a moment. Okay, so it's not really necessary to have full economies of scale all the way through, right? What you could just have is that there's economies of scale over a big range, and then there start being diseconomies, but either the market is too small to reach the point of diseconomies, or it starts to reach that part, but if you were to split the one company into two companies, it would be back in the economies of scale part, right? So even without, economies of scale all the way through, there can still be natural monopoly. And in fact, there's many cases where when a market is small, the efficient thing is just to have one company, but as the market gets bigger, it's efficient to have many. And so that's one reason why globalization and trade can help reduce the amount of monopoly, is it expands the size of the market and therefore allows for more competition. Edgar?
When you say that something is sub-additive, does that just mean that that it's most efficient to have just one firm working the market?
Yeah, that means if you have producing anything using two people is less efficient than producing that using just one person. Rocook, could you give us some examples of real-world situations that are natural monopolies?
The companies that allow fixed costs such as heat, utilities, electricity.
Yeah, those are very good examples. Those are probably the most classical examples of natural monopolies. Electrical utilities, social networks are another example, or telephone networks. So like, you know, imagine you couldn't reach anyone on any cell phone company other than your own, well then it would be it would basically be a natural monopoly, right? Because you would want to reach as many people as possible. Social networks are kind of similar. Facebook is sort of like totally dominant because everyone wants to be able to reach everybody else, right? Another example of this that I don't know if anyone read in the solution to problem set 1, but you know, imagine you have a company that is the job of monitoring people's income to figure out how much income they have. That company might, and one reason they might want to do that is for price discrimination, right? If we know people's income, we're better able to price discriminate. That might be much more efficient if it was done by a centralized agency, because if I'm monitoring Maria's income and Kenneth is her employer, then if I monitor Kenneth's income, it's going to be much easier to also monitor Maria's income because I can make sure those two things are consistent with one another, right? So there's big economies of scale in terms of monitoring income, and therefore it makes a lot of sense for the government to be in charge of all the collection of taxes rather than for individual people to be in charge of different parts of tax collection. Public transportation in many settings is also a natural monopoly. So just to give you a sense of this, the key thing is if we have two firms, average costs are always going to be bigger than if there's just one firm until we get to not just to the minimum point of the average cost, but beyond that, right? Because when we move to two firms, we take the one firm thing and we sort of have to stretch it out a bunch. And that can mean that even as the average cost starts increasing, there can still be some range over which it's still more efficient just to have one than to have two firms in the market. Okay. So the simplest solution to these problems is just to mandate that prices be equal to to marginal costs. But the problem is, not always. Not always. So in this case, marginal costs are above average costs at this point, right? But often, when there's economies of scale, price is usually below the average cost, right? Marginal cost is usually below the average cost, right? And so this means that we're going to have subsidies in order to get a firm to charge a price that's equal to marginal cost, because they're going to go bankrupt if they try to charge a price that's below their average cost, right? So to achieve marginal cost pricing, we'd have to have subsidies. And this doesn't just require having someone regulating the firm. It actually requires an active investment continuously of money from the government, right? And this money, yeah. Go ahead.
Why would marginal cost usually be below average?
So whenever average cost is falling, whenever there's economies of scale, marginal cost must be below average cost, right?
Yeah.
Because marginal cost is below average cost whenever average cost is falling, right? And so whenever there's economies of scale locally, the marginal cost will be below the average cost, right? And in order to achieve this, we'll have to put a tax on consumers. We can do, an income tax, a sales tax, and so forth, as from the past lecture. And in fact, when we talked in the last lecture about giving, back money as a lump sum transfer, a lot of this money is not actually given back directly to consumers, but instead is used to fund, as a subsidy, the services that are provided to those consumers so they can be provided at a more efficient price. So some examples are public transportation. The cost of riding on Metra or on the L is a lot less than the total, enough to cover the total cost of operating the system. They're only charging you based on your marginal cost, and then the city of Chicago makes up the difference out of general revenues. The Postal Service usually makes a loss. Most government services, like the DMV and so forth, operate at a loss, and so forth. Right? Yeah, take it.
Just, I guess, theoretically, so is it not possible for those firms to ever have profit?
For which, you mean the government ones?
Yeah. Well, anytime like your average cost is greater than your
No, because the firm could produce at the point where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. And that could lead, you see what I mean? So that's what a monopolist will typically do. Even though they have a declining... So even if a monopolist had like a marginal cost curve that was like that, and their average cost curve was like that, if their demand was up here, and their marginal revenue was down here, they produced at this point, that would give them this price, and they'd earn this profit. You see what I mean?
Wait.
Yeah.
So when you say that marginal cost equals price, what price are you referring to? Because the firm is obviously determining that price. So when they always want to charge where marginal cost equals marginal revenue?
Absolutely. But it would be socially optimal for them to charge where marginal cost is equal to price.
But where is the price? So where is that price coming from? Because in a monopoly setting,
Well, the government could just force them to charge that.
well, I'm saying, but so the efficient amount is where MC equals P.
Yeah.
But where do we get P from?
Well, you can just set P equal to MC. I mean,
But P is determined by, because in competitive, like in a competitive market, price is determined by all the other firms.
yeah.
But here you have one firm, so what's...
How do we figure out what marginal cost is what you're saying? If we're the
I'm
government
trying to
trying
figure
to
out,
break
how do you
it-
figure out where marginal cost equals price?
Yeah, I mean, so that's exactly what we're going to
Okay.
talk about.
Okay, sure.
But
Okay.
yeah, that's a
Okay.
giant problem.
Okay.
I agree with you.
Okay, fine.
So there's two other ways that have been proposed to achieve the optimum, other than just imposing marginal cost pricing. One is trying to achieve perfect price discrimination, and who wants to describe why that would achieve the optimum? Yeah.
It removes the deadweight loss, right?
Yeah, that's right. Because why does it remove the deadweight loss?
Because those exchanges that wouldn't have, if there's only one price, then the exchanges below the price but above the marginal cost would not happen.
Yep.
And the consumer surplus, as well as the producer surplus, there is not bounded.
Yep, that's right. So if a firm can perfectly price discriminate, then they can capture all that benefit and they achieve the optimum, just like we said a week ago, right? And in practice, that's really difficult, but you can get close using things like nonlinear pricing, two-part tariffs, high-quality third-degree price discrimination. And in fact, that problem is really not that different from just having a local income tax, right? Because you're trying to figure out how much are people willing to pay. That's probably pretty related to their income. And often a lot of these, a lot of these utilities end up basically charging you proportional to your income. So they basically are just charging you an income tax. Another way you can do it, which you'll see in the movie Margin Call if you come sit with us, is there's this great scene where they ask one of the guys how he spends his $1.5 million a year salary. And he says, well, I spend about $80,000 on hookers, booze, and restaurants, but actually I can expense most of that to the company. So that really doesn't count. And so that's a great example. That's not part of the marginal cost, it's just part of the average cost of him going out, right? And so he's totally willing to spend all that because he just gets reimbursed by the company, right? Pigouvian subsidies maybe are a little bit better, but they require knowing the demand curve. As Shiraj pointed out, we need to know P prime times Q to figure out what the optimal size of the subsidy is. Perfect price discrimination requires not just knowing the demand curve, but every individual person's willingness to pay, right? So that can require a ton of information as well. And even to then go and extract the money that the monopoly is making by Franchise bidding, bidding for the right to be the monopolist, requires a bunch of competitors also know how much money the monopolist is making. And another problem, which we're going to talk a bunch about on Tuesday, and which will be on your next problem set, is that, you know, if we charge a price that's equal to marginal cost, it's pretty hard to know whether it was even worth creating the market in the first place. Why is that? Well, at least if there's enough revenue to cover the average cost, or to afford some profit, we know that the consumers are willing to pay as much as the market is worth, right, at very least. However, if we charge at marginal cost, who the hell knows, right? Because at marginal cost, the firm will be making a loss. You know, who knows if it's even worth creating a product at all. So a classic example of this comes from a quote from Adam Smith, who figured this out 250 years before Sarah Palin did, which is that when the government uses general government revenue to build bridges, rather than like charging the people who go along them for the cost of building the bridge, you end up, as he said, having many bridges built over places where no commercial traffic passes, right? If you don't require it to make a profit that compensates for the investment, right, you end up getting lots of bridges to nowhere. Another problem that can arise is capture and political corruption. So regulation can quickly become a way of corruption. Regulators can get cozy with those who they regulate, and therefore allow them to make a lot of profits or do all sorts of things, actually use the regulations to keep people from competing with them. And the consumers are usually too diffuse to really stop this. This is like what happens with licensure that we talked about. While organized consumer groups can help partially balance this, when things are very opaque, when things are very hard to understand, it's very hard for the consumers to know whether corruption is going on and therefore to stop it from occurring. And in some sense, this is really just an informational problem like the other problems we were talking about. It's just that the consumers don't have enough information to monitor the people who are supposed to be monitoring the company. If everything were really transparent, if the information were really easily available, it would be very easy for a little group of consumers to just run the numbers and figure out that everything was was ripping them off. So the key problem in these regulatory issues is to make sure that there's someone in charge of making the decision who both has pretty good information and has incentives to act in the public interest. So to address some of these informational problems, it's much more common to use average cost rather than marginal cost regulation. And this is often called rate of return or cost plus regulation. And the idea is that the profits that the utility can make are capped at some low rate to justify the investment that was made. And this low rate of return is meant to cover natural returns on capital investment. So a simple model of this would just be to think of a price cap at average cost. We're going to talk about why that can be inefficient. Average cost pricing can be inefficient in a moment. But first, Vidor?
Yes.
What are some of the benefits that average cost pricing has over marginal cost pricing?
You can measure it a little bit better. You can just take the overall cost and divide instead of like...
Yeah, I think that's probably the primary benefit. So it doesn't require external subsidies. That's one good thing, right? But it's also just a lot easier to measure because you can just audit the firm and try to like make them say what all their expenses were. And marginal cost, that's very hard. It's not like you just do an audit to determine a marginal cost. You actually have to like figure out how would things change if we change the quantity. And we only need to know the average cost at a single point. So this makes David's problem much less severe, right? All we need to do is say to the company, look, if we catch you charging more than whatever your average cost is at whatever you produce, we're going to like throw you in jail. But you don't actually need to like know the whole cost curve, right? And if consumers are willing to buy at that price, then at least we know that it's worth creating the product. So average cost pricing can greatly lessen the informational problem that we have with regards to like whether the market should exist, you know, how we monitor the firm, etc. And this can be implemented either by rate of return regulation on private enterprises or by government ownership of the thing. And then once the government owns it, there's not going to be any profit paid, presumably. So the first is much more common in the OECD countries, especially the United States, where there's lots of private for-profit firms that are regulated by the government. So ComEd, I actually don't even know what that stands for. I know Ed stands for Edison. Commonwealth Edison is in charge of monitoring, is in charge of electricity in Chicago. They have a monopoly, and these are often owned by conglomerates of different utility operators. So ComEd actually runs the utilities for many different cities, not just Chicago, not just in Illinois. They're sort of, they own a bunch of these utilities. But then they're overseen by a local, state, or sometimes federal regulatory board. And these are usually made up of experts. Here in Chicago, it's the Illinois Commerce Commission. And sometimes these commissions hold an auction to own the initial right. So for example, telecommunications is basically a natural monopoly in certain areas because basically parts of the spectrum can only be efficiently occupied by one person. If other people try to get in there, it causes all sorts of interference. And so the FCC held an auction for the right to own spectrum in different parts of the country. And they use an extensive team of auditors to monitor prices and then commission research. In fact, the second long answer problem on the midterm was based on a book which was commissioned by the California regulator to study the optimal way to do second-degree price discrimination. So usually this type of regulation is not just purely economic in the way we were talking about, but also has other political goals. So David Kuo? Yeah. David, what are some of the political goals that often come up that are less economically based? Yeah, so that's an important one. Another one is environmental protection, right? So like a lot of these state electricity boards are interested in reducing the environmental impact, not just in increasing economic efficiency. Also, sometimes there are politically powerful groups that have like lobbying power, and they can often get a special deal. Okay. Average cost regulation is used very widely. It's probably the most widely used form of regulation. And Calvin, what are some areas where average cost regulation is used?
Some of them are like the natural monopolies you talk about earlier, like power, like utilities in general.
Yeah, absolutely. That's right. So utilities are one of the most important examples. These are overseen by a state regulatory board, as I said. Public transport, quite a few bridges are actually required to eventually defray the costs of building them by charging high tolls for going on the road. Sometimes they get a subsidy, sometimes not. It's actually quite controversial. A lot of the public transit in the state has been moving to higher rates to try to make up for the subsidy that they give. Telecommunications in the United States used to be a regulated monopoly until the 1980s. And local calling, yeah, go ahead.
By average cost, you mean average total cost? Or
Average total cost, yeah. So local calling was for a long time subsidized down to really low prices, and then there were high prices charged on higher long distance calling, and that all averaged out to the average cost of AT&T, and there was a federal regulatory board that was in charge of making sure that worked out. But then the DOJ, the Department of Justice, brought a lawsuit to demonopolize that industry. They broke up AT&T into all these little baby bells that you've probably heard of. And then all those baby bells started merging with one another. And now both AT&T, the original company, and Verizon, which came out of Southern Bell and bought up a bunch of the other baby bells, are now like overwhelmingly dominant companies, and then the little competitors that still exist are basically being acquired by them, as you saw with the Verizon. So part of that is just anti-competitive, but part of it is that in some ways this industry really is a natural monopoly. And so if you try to break it up and turn it into something else, it sort of naturally starts consolidating again. So there's a debate over which of those things is true, but it's definitely complicated. Also in some countries, for example Peru, there is a legal way of achieving average cost pricing through the legal system, which is that you can bring a lawsuit if a firm is abusively pricing, so-called abusively pricing. That is, they're pricing to make a very large profit. And that can effectively force companies to do something like average cost pricing. But average cost pricing can arise not just from government regulation, but also by competition in the markets. So if anyone can come into an industry, if we have free entry, then that will tend to drive prices down to cost, because anytime there's a positive profit that the firm is making, it's going to attract someone in to compete with them. Now, of course, as we said earlier, that only happens, things only get competed away if there's a large number of equally capable people who can run the industry, if they have easy access to capital and it doesn't require a lot of specialized knowledge to be in the industry, and if there are no barriers to entry. So in these cases, any profits that a firm makes will attract entrants. Yeah, Matt?
To what extent is there actually like these monopolized industries where there is free entry into these markets? Because I can't think of like a monopolized like utilities or telecommunications where there's actually free entry.
Yeah.
If there's like government subsidies going on.
Well, so I think we'll talk about a particular. So I guess what I'm trying to say is that in a lot of these natural monopolies, that's not the case. But there's lots of other. We can use an analysis of average cost regulation applied to natural monopolies to think about other cases where there sort of would be a monopoly, but there's enough ability to enter that reduces the capacity of that firm to be a monopoly. So we can think of average cost pricing not just as something imposed by regulation, but something that could be the outcome of a natural market process. And we'll see some examples of that. So that leads to average cost pricing, and this can arise in an equilibrium without regulation. It's a very common assumption in economic models. I argued in lecture 5 that it might not actually be that realistic because of the heterogeneity in different people's abilities, but it's often a useful benchmark. Now, to get back to Matt's question, how, when there is just a monopoly, could you still get something like average cost pricing? Well, there are some people who make a very bold claim, which is called the contestable markets argument, or contestability, which says that any time a firm is making a profit, it will tempt competitors to enter against it. And that a firm, even in the absence of someone competing with it, will just hold its prices very close to its average cost to avoid someone coming in to compete. And this seems a bit strange, because it requires a lot for a firm to be that afraid of someone entering against them, right? It requires that someone else can come in immediately and not just be competing with this firm, but grab the whole monopoly and earn all the profits and leave the other firm in the dust. And that seems pretty unlikely, because the other firm's probably going to try to compete with them if they enter in the industry, right? If they do, then it's not going to be the case that any profits they're making would attract in a competitor, because when the two firms are competing, then they're not going to be able to be at efficient scale, right? And they would lose money. So that's the first thing that it required. And that requires that the incumbent firm can't undercut the competitor when it comes into the market. And that there's no real fixed cost of entry or exit, because otherwise the other firm could get stuck in the industry and lose a bunch of money. So contestability, I think, is really quite implausible most of the time. However, it may be that even firms that aren't currently competing limit to some extent the prices that can be charged in the market, because people are afraid of mutual entrants. And so that means that average cost pricing can be a useful benchmark even when it's not literally possible to contest the industry, if there's a number of potential entrants if entry is quite easy and easy to reverse if it's unsuccessful. And I think that there's important economic factors that make this easier or harder. So one answer you could have given to the second short answer question about the cloud computing is the cloud has made it a lot easier to enter industries quickly and then to exit them, right? Because you're able now, rather than building up a giant server farm yourself, to actually just rent facilities for a short period of time, right? Basically just have some space on the servers, and then if you're not successful, you can stop paying for it, right? Also, the more committed the incumbent is to his price, the harder it is for him to reduce the price if you enter, the more attractive it will be for someone to enter against him. Okay, so why isn't average cost pricing efficient? Well, average costs and marginal costs are just not the same thing, right? And the social optimum is when price equals marginal cost, not average cost, right? When pricing, when marginal cost pricing leads to losses, that's because marginal cost pricing is below average cost pricing, right? And thus, average cost pricing leads to too high of a price, too low of a quantity, right? This is really not that dissimilar to monopoly pricing. It's just a little bit less extreme, right? Because a monopolist is always going to try to make positive profits, right? Not just charge a price equal to average cost. And thus they'll always charge a price that's above the average cost, and that will lead to even lower quantities than average cost pricing, right? And in fact, I want to show a very, very close relationship between these. So what is the distortion that's caused by average cost pricing? Well, we'd like prices to be marginal cost, but they're above marginal cost by the difference between average and marginal cost, right? That's the distortion caused by average cost pricing. And there's just a Harberger triangle there. What is the size of that distortion? Well, remember that the difference between average and marginal cost is the negative of the slope of average cost times quantity, right? Why is that? Well, remember the story about my wife, right? When she was the marginal person, if she was, the average cost was going to, the average score was going to rise when she, the marginal person, was above the average score, right? So similarly, the difference between average and marginal cost is equal to the slope of the average cost curve. And notice that this is really extremely similar to the monopoly distortion, right? Because average price is average revenue, right? And so it was the slope of average revenue times the quantity that was the Cournot distortion. Here it's the slope of the average cost times the quantity, which is the distortion from average cost pricing, right? And this is proportional, just like in the monopoly case, to the size of the market and to the slope of the average cost curve. That is, to the degree of economies or diseconomies of scale. And what this tells us is that even in the natural monopoly case, where there's actually marginal cost above average cost, we can still have a distortion from average cost pricing. And that actually comes from the prices being too low. So in this case, a regulator might come in and do average cost pricing, drive the firm down to this point. That would actually mean that the prices were too low and that there was too much produced. Okay, so let me give you a picture of the classic case when marginal cost is declining. We have economies of scale all the way through. So then average cost is above the marginal cost curve, right? And the equilibrium is where the demand is equal to average cost, whereas the social optimum is the place where demand equals to marginal cost, and the distortion is this Harberger triangle in between them. Okay, so at least as important of a distortion caused by our, so the static distortion caused by prices being too high or too low is an important one, but at least as important of an effect of average cost regulation is its effect on the longer term incentives. So And the reason is that companies can easily affect their costs. They can do things like go out and spend a lot of money on, wine, women, and song, as I was giving in the example from Marginal. But they could also just fail to make a lot of effort to cut costs or cut workers or something like that. They could not innovate, right? They can choose more or less expensive ways to produce. And unless these are controlled and monitored by a regulator, the firm's not going to have any incentive to reduce its cost under average cost pricing, because every time it reduces its cost, it gets less payment from the government, right? Its price has to go down exactly to compensate for that reduced cost, right? And that gives it no incentive to reduce its cost. And this is what you're going to explore on this week's problem set, which is due on Tuesday, remember. In fact, a particularly perverse example of this is when you have a regulator who's actually learning about what your costs are. He decides what he thinks your costs are likely to be tomorrow based on what your costs are today. And that gives you a huge incentive to inflate your costs today so that you'll have a bigger budget tomorrow, right? You'll get paid more tomorrow. So a classic example of this is government agencies, which have budgets each year. And their budgets are often determined by what their budget was last year. So if a government agency ends up saving money this year, that totally messes them up next year because they don't get allocated as much, because they decide, look, they can survive on less. So this happened to my father. So my father was working for a defense contractor, and they went and made a proposal to some general in the army, and they were able to do it for half the budget, right? And the guy said to him, I would be failing in my duty to my country if I spent a single cent less than was allocated in the budget for this weapons system. Because he knew that if he did, next year their budget would be cut. Yeah, Matt?
But isn't that counterbalanced by the fact that if your budget for a program gets too big, it's going to get cut entirely? At times like...
Well, that's possible. Yeah, so those are things that sort of offset each other, and that can help reduce some part of these incentives. As long as the cutting is responsive to like inflation of that sort, and that you don't just leave the big awful projects and then cut all the small efficient ones, which sometimes happens. Other causes of average cost pricing have similar problems. So even if it's not regulation that's causing the average cost pricing, still when there's average cost pricing, that can reduce incentives to cut costs. So for example, if a firm can innovate or do something else to reduce its costs, and other firms can immediately imitate them, then they have almost no incentive to do that, right? And so this is going to be the topic of Tuesday's lecture. Okay, so one important source of the fact that cost curves aren't just flat, so that they go up or down, which causes this average versus marginal cost problem, is selection. And we talked about this in lecture 3, but I want to review it again. So the idea here is that there's some policy, maybe it's insurance, maybe it's a loan that's given out, maybe it's assets that are sold, and there's some fraction of the population that participates in the transaction at a prevailing price P. But costs are not linear because different people are more or less costly to cover with the insurance or to provide a loan to, because some people are more or less likely to pay the loan back, etc. So if the riskiest people are the ones who are willing to pay the most to get the contract, if they're the first ones into the market, then we say that selection is adverse. That might happen in health insurance because the people who most want to get covered are the people who are likely to be the sickest. And Mariana, what would the slope of the cost curve look like in the case of adverse selection?
Well, since you were having the riskiest people go first, who would be willing to pay the most, it would slope downwards.
Yeah, exactly. So you'd have a downward sloping cost curve. On the other hand, we would say that there's advantageous selection if the safest people are in first. So examples of that might be, you think in the subprime housing boom, a lot of people thought the problem was that loans got so cheap that they started making them to lots of people who couldn't afford them, right? And that would be a case of advantageous selection. The people who were willing to pay the most were the people who had too high, who were, the people who were willing to pay the most were the safest people. People who were willing to pay less were less safe, right? Another example of that could be in insurance. Imagine that some people sort of know about all the risks to their health. The people who really know about the risks to their health are probably also going to be the people who are going to get a lot of insurance, but they're also going to be the people who are going to take better care of their health, right? And so in that case, you might have advantageous selection. The people who are willing to pay the most for health care are actually the people who are the least risky. And in what direction would the cost curves slope in that case? Coal? Is coal here? No. Well, basically, obviously, it's the opposite, right? The cost curves slope upwards, right? So this sort of situation could arise in insurance when, like, the poor, uneducated people choose not to get insurance. And of course, a mixture is possible. It doesn't always slope down or up. It could go up and down and so forth. So there could be adverse selection over some regions, advantageous over others. Notice that this is the cost curve not of an individual insurer, an individual loan maker, but of the industry as a whole. But a lot of these things like insurance and credit are things that we think about for the country as a whole. And so it's not, we can think of the whole country as having a cost curve like this. Now, unless an insurer is able to discriminate and charge different prices to different people based on their health conditions, the insurer is basically, if he offers to sell insurance, going to get a pretty representative sample of the whole population of people, right, who will sign up for insurance with them. And under these cases, the cost to him for insuring more people is exactly the average cost, right? If he attracts one more person, he just has to pay the average cost of insuring that person. And so equilibrium with free entry, and this gets back to Matt's question, in this type of a market, is exactly going to be average cost pricing, right? So that's a case where competition leads us to average cost pricing, even though it's not, there's not sort of any monopoly type thing. And that average cost pricing may well be inefficient for the same reason it is in the regulation type context that we were talking about. Anything you can say about the regulation of a natural monopoly, you can say about these selection markets, basically. So when selection is advantageous, we might get too much insurance. Or in the case of the housing market, I think a lot of people think that there was too much lending to people who couldn't afford to repay the loans, because everyone was trying to get the few people who could afford to repay the loans. They were all charging the average cost, or giving people the price relative to the average repayment, rather than charging them based on the fact that those people were very unlikely to repay. On the other hand, when selection is adverse, there's too little insurance. These people are afraid to wind up with all the people who are very sick. And a very extreme case of this is what's called a death spiral, which is that basically, imagine the market price for insurance is currently $100. The average person who's willing to buy it at $100 costs $200 to insure. Well, so then you raise the price to $200. Oh, but then the average person who's willing to pay that much actually is costs $500 to insure them. So you raise the price to $500. Well, but then only the really sick people are willing to take the insurance, right? So you have to raise the price to $1,000, and it just keeps going higher and higher. That's what happened in your last problem set in part 2 towards the end, was that if you make people pay to set up their stand in the street a certain amount of money, only the people in the really busy parts of town will set up under that amount. So you're going to then, that causes a big externality, so you raise it. But then it's only people in the even busier parts of the town. And the whole market sort of collapses that way. And it was that sort of a quote-unquote death spiral that we were really afraid of when Obama set up the Health Insurance Act. Because they were afraid that if you didn't force everyone to buy insurance, no one, that the whole market would collapse because the prices would keep rising higher and higher. Another example of this is so-called Gresham's law. Gresham's law says that if you have two different currencies, one which is doesn't actually have that much gold in it, and one which has a lot of gold in it, and it's either legally required that you use those as the same, or people just can't tell them apart very easily, right? That corresponds to the case where you can't tell how sick someone is, or you're not allowed to price based on how sick they are. Then everybody ends up keeping the gold currency at home because it's super valuable, and then using the crappy currency to transact in the marketplace. And so having that bad money around drives the good money out of the marketplace. And this is a major fear that motivated the mandatory insurance that was mandated under the Obama plan. And David, how could we graphically represent this in terms of cost curves, a death spiral?
Well, so you have, I guess you would have decreasing, or I guess you would have increasing costs, because as you sort of try to increase you try to increase the price, you have to, I guess it would be decreasing then,
yeah,
right?
That's right.
Okay, it's decreasing, because as you try to increase the price, fewer and fewer people are willing to actually purchase your product.
That's right, but as we saw on the earlier slide, we can have decreasing cost without a death spiral, right? So this case was decreasing cost, but there was an equilibrium. So in what case would we get a death spiral?
Well, obviously, if you can't find the equilibrium.
That's right. So when would that happen? Think about the logic we were going through. I was saying, when there's this many people in the market, the cost of covering them is higher. Then you raise the price, still the cost of covering them is higher. When you raise the price, still the cost of covering them is higher.
Okay.
When could that happen?
Would it have to do with the way the demand curve is structured? Or is it purely based on...
Well, it's both. It's about the relationship between the demand and the
Okay,
cost.
so it's like what we were saying about the equilibrium or stability
Yeah.
condition. So it has to be that the demand curve has to cut from... If it doesn't cut from above, then you can't find equilibrium.
Yeah, that's very close to right. So what I would say is the simplest case is just that the average cost curve is always above the demand curve, right? Because I said, imagine these many people in the market. Well, the average cost of covering them is above that. Okay, so then we charge that price. Well, then the average cost of then these many people are in the market, and the average cost of covering is still above that. As long as the average cost curve is always above the demand curve, you get this death spiral, right? But the marginal cost curve could well be below that. And so it could be socially optimal to cover everyone, and yet it could be impossible to cover anyone. On the other hand, we could have advantageous selection, in which case the cost curves slope up, right? In that case, the marginal cost curve is above the average cost curve, and we actually have too much insurance rather than too little, or too many loans rather than too few. Okay, so selection is thus the slope of the cost curve, and we know that we can recover the slope of the cost curve, that the slope of the cost curve gives us the difference between the average and marginal cost curve, and so it gives us the wedge. So if we can measure the amount of selection, right, we can also measure the distortion created by selection. And this is exactly what Laurent Aynave and co-authors did in 2010. We studied this in lecture 3, but I want to come back to it. So what they did is they had a large aluminum manufacturer who offered 2 different types of health plans. The first was very minimal. It was basically hardly any insurance. It was just a very low coverage plan. And the second plan was quite comprehensive. It offered a lot of insurance. And individual division managers got to choose the prices that they offered to their particular group division for these 2 different insurance things. They claimed that these division managers basically chose these things randomly. It's a little bit questionable whether that's really the case, but if it is true, then that gives us random variation in price that lets us get different fractions of the population covered. And then we can just look at how many people in that part of the population, in that division, end up getting how sick, how costly was it to cover those people under the plans, right? And we can thus measure the average cost of the claimants and draw out the average cost curve, and then we can use this, the slope of this, to determine where the marginal cost curve is and determine the distortion. And of course, the size of the distortion depends not only on the cost curve, but also on the demand curve. The demand curve is completely inelastic. There would be no distortion regardless. The demand curve is very flat, and there can be a huge distortion even from a small change between those two things. Okay, so here's exactly what they did. What they did is they looked at different divisions, places where different prices were charged. So in this division, this price was charged. In this division, this price was charged. In this division, this price was charged, and so forth. And then they figured out how many people chose to purchase. So here's the fraction choosing to purchase at the different prices. Then for each one of these dots where there is a certain fraction that chose to purchase, they measured through auditing the insurer what the average claims were for insurance for those people. So that's this dot here for this one, this dot here for this one, and so forth. And then they just drew this marginal cost line through that, average cost line through that, and then they took the derivative of that, and that gave them the marginal cost curve. Right? And so where was the distortion from adverse selection? Well, if you have this marginal cost curve, and these white dots represent the demand curve, they chose to draw a line through this to like this point here. So that would leave this triangle here. I think it looks a little bit more concave, so I would have said it looks like that, and then it would be this little area here. Right? That's exactly the distortion from adverse selection, because here was the intersection between demand and average cost. Okay. So, yeah.
How does the selection stuff relate to the monopoly stuff that you're studying? Or like, in which cases are monopolies like in circumstances where there's adverse or advantageous selection?
You mean if you had a monopolist and selection at the same time?
Yeah, I'm just trying to see how like the second half of the selection, like the selection part, reflects like
Well, so my point was that what we did in the first part of the lecture, right, was analyze the distortions that come from forcing someone to price at average cost.
Yeah.
And we said that that can arise not just because of a regulation, but because of market forces. And now we're looking at the distortions that show up in a market where average cost pricing arises because of market forces rather than because of, Okay. So that's it. So, you guys should fill these out. You should give them to Suraj. He will bring them back to Robert. And good luck on the problem set. We've got extra time now, so I'm very happy to take questions from people, but you can just come up here and ask me.